everyone, and welcome back to our Horizontes leadership series. My name is John Price. I'm Managing Director of AMI. And just a few months ago, we launched Horizontes. Some of you, I believe, have participated in previous interviews we've held. Today, I'm coming to you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is fitting because it's my pleasure to be interviewing an old friend, Kelvin Dushnisky, former CEO of Anglogold Ashanti and former president of Barrick, a mining veteran, many years in the business with a very interesting background. And I think for all of you in the mining industry, you probably know Kelvin by name. He certainly was a very high profile executive at both those companies, particularly Barrick, where he often took on the interviews with Wall Street journalists as a publicly traded company. And today we're going to talk about really an interesting topic for many people, including other sectors like energy and infrastructure, and that is community and politics in Latin America. And as a gold miner, what it means to interface with those forces as well as others as you try to put together long-term capital-intense projects in Latin America. Before I formally introduce Kelvin, I'm going to just refresh your memory as to what Horizontes is all about and what AMI is all about. This is our fifth interview series. I participated as both moderator and speaker in one of them, but we've had a really talented roster of leaders in their respective industries. We spoke with Maren Lau of Meta. We spoke with Mauricio Ortiz of Boston Scientific. We spoke with Dominique Verchot of Korn Ferry. And today we're speaking with Kelvin Dushnisky. Now, you, as those of you who hear from us are on our database, so to speak, registered database, you should receive every once in a while also a reading list that we like to put out of what we consider to be, really telling articles, white papers, interviews, and such from other sources as well as our own that we think you'll find interesting. Horizontes was launched ostensibly to really provide better guidance and input from mentors who walk in your shoes, as people like yourselves who are in charge of multiple jurisdictions in Latin America, be it running the operations of your organization or a portion of your organization. It's difficult to find good sources of inspiration and good sources of leadership for what is a very unique universe in which we operate as multi-jurisdictional leaders in Latin America. And Horizontes was really spawned by AMI. And on the next slide, you'll see a little bit about who AMI is. We've been in business for a little over 30 years, advising companies on good business decisions in Latin America. And how do we do that? We do that by gathering useful, actionable intelligence, be it from their customers and potential customers, the competition, as well as better understanding the political, economic, and regulatory context. And it is that third area that has really been particularly important in work that we've done in mining and in energy. And that's why I was so keen to get Kelvin to join us today. Kelvin, if you wouldn't mind turning back on your camera, and we'll begin chatting. Great to see you, my friend.
Great to be here, John. Thank you very much for having me. And your recollection is quite good, by the way, in terms of my origins. I'll give you a little more background if that's helpful.
Sure, that'd be great. Love to. I think it'd be very helpful before we get into the meaty subjects. Learn a little bit about more of who you are.
Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, you're right, John. I was raised in Manitoba. In fact, in a small farming community in rural Manitoba. I did my first degree at the University of Manitoba, and I graduated from there. I went to University of British Columbia in Vancouver, attended graduate school at UBC, And when I finished that, I joined a Vancouver-based consulting company called ResCan. And ResCan was founded, and its CEO was a gentleman well known in mining circles, a gentleman by the name of Clem Pelletier. And I worked together with Clem for about a decade. Interestingly, Clem had come from BHP, had worked there for a number of years. And so BHP was really our anchor client at ResCan. And from that, the company expanded. The client list included, I'm going by memory now, but the likes of Rio Tinto, Kennecott, Cyprus Amax at the time, Asarco and Southern Peru Copper in Peru. Placer Dome was a client, Teck, Billiton, quite a long list. And
Sure.
it really from junior exploration companies all the way to more senior producers. And the company had some exposure to the forest sector, which you'd expect in being BC-based, financial institutions, some industrial business, but the great majority of the business was in the mining sector. And so for me, when I was starting, I guess, I don't know, I was 24, 25 at the time. Honestly, it's happenstance. I wouldn't have known a mine, John, if you had dropped me in the middle of one at the time. But it's just kind of interesting how things evolved from that point to now. But that was the start in terms of the background.
Well, that makes sense. And in that consulting capacity, were you involved in legal matters, or was it more broad?
The consulting, the business was really around a number of things. First of all, kind of all the environmental services and related things associated with getting new projects developed. And where I focused principally in that business was on kind of new project permitting, and all the regulatory approvals, et cetera, needed to bring new projects on stream. That was an area where I spent most of my time.
And in that consulting decade, were those projects or any of those projects you're working on in Latin America?
Yeah. In fact, the starting project for us would have been Escondida, BHP's big. There was a consortium at the time, but BHP first brought us to Escondida. Closely after that, I think, was Asarco and Southern Peru Copper, their operations in Peru. While I was at ResCan, there was also Placer Dome was active, and we went with them to various places, including in Venezuela, which was interesting. Another Canadian client at the time in Venezuela was a company called Vengold, then a Vancouver-based business. And I was also spending a lot of time at that point in northern Chile, northern South America, with Golden Star, Cambio. These were projects in Guyana, French Guiana, Suriname. So really across the continent. But it would have been those early kind of anchor clients with Barrick that first took us into Latin America. And then I guess it was the early 1990s, I went back to law school at UBC. When I finished studying there, I joined a client company by the name of Sutton Resources. And Sutton had two principal assets in Tanzania, Africa. One was Bulyanhulu, which was a gold asset, and the other was Kabanga, a nickel cobalt asset. And then I think in 1999, Sutton was acquired by Barrick. And that was really my first introduction. I think I'd done some client work for Barrick along the way, but that was my first introduction to Barrick, really, and inner workings of the company. And it was after joining Barrick that I had much more kind of corporate experience in Latin America. And that started with the first project I was associated with was a project called Alto Chicama. Then the name changed to Lagunas Norte. But this is a project in Peru. And I think it was Barrick's first significant project after Piorina. And Piorina, also in Peru, was Barrick's, I think, first large project outside of North America. So I was kind of at the early stages of Barrick's kind of venturing into Latin America. It was very good timing. And so that first project I was involved with, Lagunas Norte, was fascinating because for me, and I think it's a record that's going to stand for a very long time, that project went from discovery, first drill hole, to production in just over 3 years.
Wow.
Which is basically unheard of. I can't ever happening again for a project of its size and scale. And it's a great op. And Piorina was a great mine. Lagunas was a great mine. And then from there, well, now I joined Barrick full time at this point. The next project I had in Latin America was now in Barrick, was Veladero. Great mine, high elevation in San Juan in Argentina. So it's high elevation in the Andes, a very, very good asset, tier one mine for Barrick, and has been for a long time and still producing. So that was kind of the introduction and the shift from ResCan, the consulting role, into Barrick and the kind of the full-time corporate role. When I joined,
that's very interesting, because I was unaware of your decade of consulting and just obviously the breadth of projects that you were engaged with. That really, yeah, that must have been quite the learning process and very valuable to your future employer, Barrick. Yeah.
Great experience. I have to say, when I look back, all the where the foundation where that was built was clearly during that decade, and the ability to work with excellent companies and their teams and learn from them.
Sure.
It would be hard to replace that.
Sure. So you've had the benefit now with that decade plus at least 2 decades and working in 2 of the biggest mining companies the gold mining world has ever seen. That's 3 decades of experience, dozens of projects, hundreds of trips into the region. You have the benefit of looking back and seeing how things developed. What are some of the sort of fundamental paradigm shifts in the industry or in the region, or a combination of both, that you've seen that have changed the industry?
Well, this is going to date me a little, John, but I think unequivocally the biggest thing from my perspective is really the introduction and widespread adoption of the internet. And I say that, it sounds a little odd, I know, and it's changed our lives in so many ways, but when I think back to the early my consulting time, typically when a client would come in, first question they'd want to know is new project, how long is it going to take to get approved, and what's the cost going to be? And you could estimate, and of course they're interrelated, and the longer it takes, typically the longer it costs, and you can understand why that would be meaningful. And at the time, we could tell pretty reliably within, I don't know, I'm going to say 3, 4, 5, 6 months what the timeline would be, and it would depend very much on a few things. First of all, obviously the nature and complexity of the project, that was part of it, but almost as importantly is where it was located. So at that time, if a project was located in a kind of remote jurisdiction where there wasn't easy access to it, you would typically have a reasonably, a defined timeline, and it would be shorter than for projects that would be located in a more urban setting with lots of access and kind of nearby traffic and so on and so forth. And what's happened, and the reason for that is, of course, that, for a more remote project at that time, there was less likelihood of people visiting the project, of it being a concern to regulators and others that, if there weren't nearby populations and so forth, and which is all very logical. But what happened over the last kind of couple of decades with the transparency, the access to real-time data, the access to kind of real-time visual information associated with the internet, that's changed entirely. And I think for the better, to be honest. And so I in some ways, I consider the internet kind of the great equalizer as far as that goes. But it also means there's been a bit of a shift in that, where in the old days, you could have predictability around timing associated with the remote project. Now that's changed. And in a lot of respects, a remote project to some is considered kind of more sensitive and more difficult to get approval for, because it's in an area that may be untouched, so let's leave it that way, as opposed to an area where there's already some disturbance and therefore, it's considered more acceptable. So to me, that's been a fundamental change.
Yeah, I completely concur. And the other thing is that, again, within the Latin American context, traditionally, miners relied upon national governments, not only for the permitting, but also to be their partner through operations. And if there were disturbances, if there was troubleshooting to be done, it was the national government, sometimes with the aid of the military, to provide that troubleshooting. That, of course, sometimes led to abuse. And so when particularly the advent of smartphones gave essentially cameras to everyone in Latin America, I think 70% of the population now has one, everything was transparent. Everything was so, and at the same time, you know, legitimate grievances were put out for the world to see, but also people who wanted to slow down operations for their own agenda now had a powerful tool to use as well. So it's become such a big challenge. I think something like close to 300 mining and energy projects today in Latin America are either delayed or canceled because of ostensibly community opposition. And again, sometimes it's legitimate grievances and sometimes it's just unsubstantiated fears that are being flamed by people with their own agenda and using this hyper-transparent world. But it's been such an adjustment for mining companies to learn this. As you know, one of the things I've always found interesting about your background, Kelvin, is that, you know, you're a lawyer by training. Now I understand you got, now better understand you got a broad training also through a decade of consulting, but, you know, so many mining executives began as mining engineers, and mining engineers in those isolated environments, usually in a country like Canada or Australia, and so they weren't trained in dealing with community and politics and very unpredictable politics, which you often find particularly at regional levels in Latin America. So, you know, it's been, as someone on the outside looking at this industry very closely, it's been very eye-opening to see it, but also very encouraging to see mining companies adapting to this and really becoming more forthright, because they understand, you know, there's lots of pressure on them, not just locally, but from their own shareholders. And also, you know, a genuine, I think, desire to do the right thing. And it's been quite a transformation.
Well, John, I think you're right. You hit on a number of things. And first of all, I'm very encouraged because I see, you know, I think back to where we were 30 years ago. I think of where we are today. Your comment, I think, is fair in that if you think historically, you know, who ran mining companies, if you go back 20, 30 years ago, they were people often kind of technically trained, technically oriented. And in fairness to them, I mean, the world has changed a lot between then and now. And kind of what they were, if you will, kind of graded on wasn't necessarily strong kind of social, cultural, and other skills, call it the softer skills, as they were the hard technical skills. And so that's completely understandable. The good news is, I think that, you know, as things have progressed, when I look at kind of this generation of mine GMs and kind of senior people in mining companies, and I've had very good exposure to that through things like the Mining Association of Canada, the World Gold Council, the International Council of Mining and Metals. And you see it's a different generation in terms of its thinking. And I would say almost without exception, people leading these companies now are very in tune to the kind of social dynamic, the cultural dynamic. And that's come from some hard lessons along the way, in that you can have the best run mine and the best asset on earth, but if outside the fence, you've got resistance and you've got road closures and you've got protests, et cetera, one, from a media and investor perspective, that's obviously very concerning. And two, just from a purely operational perspective, it's very difficult. And I guess the third is, in terms of your own workforce, kind of morale and motivation, et cetera, very challenging. So I think the industry is in a very good space. And there's a room to improve, of course, but I think the industry is in a good space. And again, when I started the comment about the internet being the great equalizer, you made another point, which is, I think, correct, is that if you go back historically, how did people get access to information about projects? Not just through the permitting phase, but once they're operating. You know, they would be in kind of quarterly or other reports that might be published around an operation. A lot of the kind of operating detail isn't included in that just because of the sheer volume of it. Whereas now, kind of real time data can be available in terms of kind of permit compliance, environmental performance, all the other things that are relevant. And so I think in a lot of respects, it's positive because, you know, when there's a vacuum, it's typically filled with either negativity or concern and suspicion. And to the extent companies are able to now fill that vacuum with real data, real information, including visually showing that there's not damage happening on site and damage happening off site, I think it's a real plus. And so using that tool properly, I think is a really good thing. Has it taken a little while to adapt? Yes. But as I said, I think from an industry perspective, I think we're in very good shape.
It's a great point. Now, the term ESG, environment, social, and governance, has really, become a groundswell, not only from an operational point of view, but also from a due diligence point of view, looking at a potential mine investment. And of course, I bring it up because there's people on this call who aren't from the mining industry, and they may have their own definition of ESG or their own priorities within those three areas, because I do think it's different in different sectors. For mining, talk to us a little bit about the three pillars of ESG. Which do you think are the most important? And it's obviously it has become more important for mining companies, but how and how are they acting upon it? How does it impact the way they look at mines?
Yeah, that's a really good question, John, as well. I actually think the kind of rise in prominence in ESG now is a direct extension of what we talked about earlier in terms of internet, social media, and more kind of visibility into the sector and transparency around it. And so I think that when your question, of the three pillars, ES and G, which is most important, I think they're all equally important. But I think I'd say this, that first of all, if you don't get the environment piece right, the rest doesn't matter, because you will by definition be offside everything else. So you have to get that right. The good news is, with technological advances, industry best practices, I think we're in a very good position to get that right. And sometimes it's a little more complicated. Sometimes, it takes a little more work. Other times not. But I do think we're at that place. And I think there's a general acceptance with regulators and with stakeholders that if companies, acting responsibly, put in place the right technologies, that environmental protection can be assured. Now, are there going to be upsets from time to time? Yes. Are there going to be mistakes and missteps? Yes. But good companies respond to those quickly. They deal with it, and they do everything possible to not repeat it. I think that's important. So of the three, I would say that first and fundamentally, you must get the environment piece right. I think that the comment about kind of the internet and social media has really shifted the importance of the S piece of it, the social, cultural, community, stakeholder. And just anecdotally, I when you think back, when I'd be in investor meetings, even 5-6 years ago, then it wasn't ESG, it was EHS, environment, health, and safety, but similar issues and challenges. And back then, those things would come up at the end of a meeting, sometimes as you're leaving the meeting, as, I don't want to say a box ticking exercise, because that'd be unfair. And in certain cases where those were, big issues, with an asset or with a company, then of course they would have more attention. But not like now. Today, I've been in many meetings where the first topic on the agenda is ESG related, and that might dominate the entire meeting. And you may talk about the other aspects of the business, at the end and on the way out. And so that's been a real fundamental shift we've seen. And I'd say, maybe off a little bit, but I'd say that's really over the last 5-6 years, and more intensively over the last 2 or 3 years, I would say. And so, I think that's kind of an important piece. And I do think that evolved naturally from the kind of more transparency and the visibility into the business that has come with the internet as well.
The pressures to change, which we've talked about, this world of hyper transparency, the communities, the local governments, shareholders. What about lenders, project lenders, financiers? How are they shaping ESG into their lending? Are there conditions, penalties? How are they quantifying ESG in how they lend money?
Well, I think it's a very strong filter. And I think lenders look at the kind of the issues companies may be grappling with, to the same extent as a regulator, and maybe more. They're putting money at risk, and regulators have pressures, obviously, in terms of they approve a project and something goes badly, well, then they're held to account. But from a lender's perspective, the ESG lens and filter is a higher crossbar now than it's probably ever been. And so they look right down, granularly into not just kind of the operating parameters, but clearly the social aspects, license to operate, is there community and stakeholder support? How do you demonstrate that you have community and stakeholder support? at the end of the day, lenders understand as well. I mean, one, they don't want to be associated with quote unquote bad projects, and two, they don't want to be in a position where there's, there are optics around this, and so nobody wants to be associated with something that has, attracts a lot of negative headlines.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Kelvin, you and I first met, going back over a decade, I guess, when you were overseeing the Pueblo Viejo project in the Dominican Republic for Barrick. And that was, for me, a fascinating project, a very historical mine that had been sort of brought back to life by new technology, but also a project that had its own baggage and legacy long before Placer Dome and Barrick, took it over. It was a project with challenges, but ultimately a financial success for Barrick. In your mind, what are some of the lessons learned by Barrick, during the purchase, government negotiations, project development, launch, et cetera, the different phases of the project?
That's a really interesting one, John. You touched on, and again, I forgot that we actually met around PV. I guess a few things. First of all, Barrick didn't acquire PV directly. PV came with the acquisition of Placer Dome,
right?
And that was in 2005, 2006, 6, 7. I can't recall it precisely. But when we acquired Placer, PV was one of the projects in their pipeline. And at the time, I think it was at feasibility stage. And so that feasibility work was then completed, if I remember correctly, while the asset was owned by Barrick. For me, it was fascinating because, to see a project like that go from feasibility right through all the various stages to production, you don't get to see that a lot. Some of the challenges with PV, and you'll recall this well yourself, is that it was the largest at the time, and I'm sure still is. It was the largest industrial investment in the largest foreign investment in the country in its history. Yeah. I think it was $3.6 billion, if I remember correct at the time, the final number. And there's obviously been more investment since. But and in addition to that, the Dominican Republic isn't a country where there was a long kind of mining history and culture. Although there was a nickel mine, Falcondo nickel, that had operated in the DR, and I think it was under care and maintenance, if I remember correctly, when we were moving forward with PV. And in any event, that's a project that would have been built in kind of a different era, different time, with kind of different constraints. But with PV, it was interesting. There were a lot of challenges, just given the scale and scope and size of the project. The fact there wasn't kind of a mining culture and history. There weren't a lot of people on the island, obviously, who had the technical experience with mining operations. There was a ton of training and other things necessary. But I'd say that the kind of the most notable challenges, kind of, you could put them in various buckets. First of all, technologically, this is a project that required very sophisticated processing technology. You might remember one of the pieces of that were something called autoclaves, which Barrick operated very well in Nevada, its Gold Strike mine. But this is the first time using that autoclave technology, certainly in a place like the DR. And these autoclaves are kind of high pressure vessels, so you treat ore at high temperature and high pressure to liberate the gold. But these vessels are very sophisticated. They're huge. If I remember correctly, they were assembled in Malaysia, I believe, and shipped from Malaysia to the DR in specialized overseas shipping vessels. When they arrived, we had to have specialized flatbed trucks, articulating flatbed trucks to move them. These are, John, there were 3 or 5 of them. I think they're the size of like a small submarine. I mean, they're massive.
Right. Roads
had to be redesigned, bridges had to be rebuilt, had to get community support all along the way to be able to bring these through. And that's not necessarily, it sounds like it's pretty straightforward, but
no, I remember getting through town was a tricky situation. And
that was a tricky thing. If you remember, at one point we had to agree to kind of remove a corner of a park and then rebuild it and reestablish it and improve on it. And that took some time to persuade people it could be done safely, which of course it was. But so there was the technological aspect. The other was I would call it just the general logistics associated with a big project like this in a country that hadn't seen that kind of development. So, I mean, imagine some things we could procure locally, but the capital equipment, the supplies, the obviously people immigrating, bringing in kind of expat labor, some of which would stay, some of which would go, and everything associated with that, getting it all to site, building the camps and facilities at site. That was a big challenge. And then I think culturally, I touched on the point earlier that there hadn't been a history of mining in the area.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of concern in the DR, and you'll recall this. A couple of things. First of all, it's an island known for tourism, so there was a worry that now you start putting large-scale mining in the context of tourism, and even though where the mine's located is quite removed from the tourist area, to a lot of people it doesn't really matter. I mean, what benefit are they going to see from a mine being there relative to what they would get from what already exists in the tourist trade? And so, as a result of that, it took a lot of work to try and kind of win over the hearts and minds of local populations that the project could be built responsibly, could be operated responsibly, that people wouldn't be negatively impacted from it, that benefits from the project would flow through to the communities. And at that time, one of the challenge, John, as well, and this was kind of the political angle in terms of buckets, was very strong support at the federal level for the project. But there was always some tension that existed between the local communities and province and the national government, because the sense was the company comes in, builds a mine locally, the federal government gets the benefits from it in terms of taxes, royalties, payments, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's local hiring and local procurement. But in terms of kind of revenues, the worry was that never gets redistributed back locally. And so there was tension between the federal government and the local and provincial governments. And as often happens, the companies get caught in the middle. And so
I agree. Yeah.
And if a company can't get what it feels it should be getting from a national government, well, the easiest lever is to, cause challenges and issues at the mine, i.e. road blockades and otherwise, because locally they know, well, the government's federally is going to have to step in to try and fix that, so revenues flow again. So that was one of the challenges. So I would kind of put those buckets together, and so that whole kind of stakeholder piece, it was not surprising, but I think it probably took longer than we may have anticipated early on to get kind of local acceptance for the project, and that was one of the lessons, I guess.
Yeah, I think you've raised a really, really valid point here. There's such a difference between a country like Peru, Chile, Guyana, where the entire political class is pretty well steeped in the economics of mining, understand that these are projects that take a long time to develop and take a long time to bring economic benefit to the country, but they create huge tax benefits to the country, and that's money that, as politicians, they welcome in terms of their own projects. And when you take a country like the DR, the political class didn't understand mining, outside of a pretty small number of them. And then I think that the population was neither pro or against mining. They just didn't know much about it at all. But that means that they're open to being, their minds are open to be molded by who has the strongest narrative. So it becomes a sort of, if you're up against a formidable opponents to a project, and they can, legitimately or illegitimately control the media messaging, they can easily change public consensus from don't have an opinion on it to suddenly have a very strong opinion on it. And we see that all over Latin America, but in countries that have been through mining and mining projects, they're a little bit less receptive to sudden changes in messaging because they've heard it before. But when you're in an environment like the DR where there isn't a history of mining projects, then people will believe what they're told, and I think that can be challenging for sure.
Yeah, and it goes, John, to I think a really important point in that is the necessity to engage locally early, very early. I mean, ideally during the project design stage, so people locally on the ground feel they have some input into that to the extent you can, and it's sensible to do that. And I think the other really important point and a lesson learned at PV was don't presume that just because of the economic benefits that are going to flow from a project, that will necessarily equate to kind of wholesale acceptance of it, right? Because it will help in certain areas, but not entirely. And to some, it has zero meaning. And so you really need to spend time, as I said, engaging early, communicating early, being consistent with messaging, and making a commitment, making sure you live up to that commitment. People have very long memories, especially if they feel that commitments were made and left unmet. Very hard to recover from that. So all the things you just characterized are absolutely correct. And so like almost every project, you learn lessons along the way, which should make the next one a little easier and a little better. Sometimes sometimes that's true, sometimes not.
Right. Another interesting aspect is the DR is a very centralized, political structure. So there are mayors, et cetera, but there's no states or provinces. And so you don't have that kind of mid-tier political structure that really needs to be given another level of prioritization. But you have to deal with the entire population of the DR in terms of your PR campaign, because the political class that's actually going to make your life easier or difficult is actually responding at the national level and not necessarily response to the local. Whereas in a country like Peru or Argentina, those regional politics become much more important because they actually have levers of power. So, how you devise your public relations budget and strategy, and how you devise your government relations strategy is going to change depending upon the power structure of a particular country.
Well, that's right, John. The other point to make in what you just said is that it's also a mistake to presume that just because a project's been granted a permit, and approvals from a national level, even at provincial level, to presume that gives you the right then or the ability to develop kind of irrespective of anything else is a big mistake. That's the starting, it's table stakes. You have to have that, or else there's not even a further discussion. Once you have it, you still have to have the local support and kind of community acceptance of the project. And that went to the kind of earlier point about making sure you've engaged early, often, consistently, transparently, kind of, one message, and be clear about it, and allow people time to kind of think and understand what's going on, genuinely accept and encourage their input. And it's only with that, together with the permit, that you can actually move forward. One without the other, we've seen time and time again that just results in problematic situations.
100% agree. I might even go as far to say that even if you don't have to run a community referendum, in other words, if you're not obliged legally, or if the government regulations don't oblige you to, it might be a good idea to do, or at least test the waters, because otherwise that hangs over you as a kind of a threat. What is your thought on the use of referendums to gain and galvanize that community support?
Well, whether it's referendum or I think back to, when I go back to the 90s, we used to have regular town hall meetings when we would have, be going through the permitting process, and then beyond the permitting process, we continue with town hall meetings, just update everybody on what was going on with the project. And in some ways, John, to my earlier point about, what's good about the internet is free and ready access to information by people who are interested in having it. I think at the same time, it's created I don't want to say a complacency, but I think, and I will only speak now for companies with which I've been associated, I don't think we've done a good enough job of continuing with the kind of in-person communication and exchange of information once a project's approved and up and running and built. Everyone gets busy, and of course that happens, but I think there's a lot to be said for, just like it's important to engage and have consistent, steady communication through an approval process, I think you have to continue with that exact same approach and treatment when a project is operating. So don't rely on the fact that, yes, we publish information and yes, people have access to it, because it's not the same. I mean, there's nothing better in my view than town halls where you invite people to talk about what they like about what you're doing, and importantly, what they don't like about what you're doing.
Yeah.
So to the extent possible, you can fix it. You won't always get that by having information, again, available on the internet. And often when it does surface, it's in the form of a protest or a blockade or other things that you may well have been able to avoid.
Sure. We have a great question from Monica Ospina, and I'll sort of summarize it as follows. She's sort of implying or inferring in her remarks that the additional concern, which becomes obligations around ESG, seems to be impacting both operational stability and the ability to generate enough exploration that brings projects into development. And that is potentially a long-term issue around supply, will hurt supply in the future. What are your thoughts there? Because I mean, I think everyone agrees ESG needs to be taken into consideration, but has it become, or is it our inability to reach a consensus on how to deal with it become a roadblock or a bottleneck to our ability to keep supply up with demand? What are your thoughts there?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I guess my response to that would be, I don't think ESG is prohibitive in terms of conducting exploration. And I think, in fact, one of the most important things a company can do is ensure that its exploration teams are well trained culturally in ESG, et cetera, et cetera. And I say that because, and I think in large part, I think that's the case. But there certainly have been instances where, exploration teams have, maybe been a little careless, drive through creeks when they shouldn't, do other things on site which cause kind of local concerns. And as opposed to being kind of goodwill ambassadors for the company and creating a kind of a terrific first step in terms of doing what's necessary to build kind of stakeholder consent, the opposite can happen. So right out of the gate, you're fighting an uphill battle because people talk and it gets around. And if the view is that exploration hasn't been conducted responsibly and in a respectful way, that can have serious implications on everything else you intend to do, and not just there, but word tends to spread. And so I think that's really important. But look, one thing that's clear is when you look out over the last decade plus, the number of kind of large new deposits that have been discovered worldwide is not large. You can count it on one hand. And so what does that mean? Clearly it means that on a going forward basis, companies are going to have to do everything they can to continue to, operate the assets they have and expand around them to the extent possible. And so partly to the question about exploration around existing operations, I mean, I think that's always fundamental. Adding reserves to existing mine life is something that every company is doing all the time, replacing production on an annual basis and more. So exploration budgets are very much zeroed in on that, as well as greenfields exploration. So I think done right, I don't think there's a prohibition to it. But again, I think that probably today more than if you think back 20, 30 years ago, more time up front in getting approvals for exploration, spending time with local communities doing, explaining what the exploration will look like, how it's being conducted, etc. There's probably a higher crossbar now for doing that well. And when I say crossbar, I don't mean from a regulatory perspective. I mean from a company's ability to gain that social acceptance to move to the next step if they're successful in finding what they hope to find.
Sure. Well, that raises the point in terms of, if you were advising mining companies today and they're looking at a project and what would you tell them in terms of must have? So let's assume it's a project that's already developed and you're looking at acquiring it. What are some of the must-haves that a project should already have in place, and versus, as well as what are some of the red flags that would give you great concern about pulling the trigger on buying a mine?
Yeah. Well, I guess a few things. First of all, in terms of must-haves, I think that A well-defined and clear mining code has to be number one. And tied to that kind of clear titling process, so you know you own what you're acquiring, and that's unequivocal. Tied to that, rule of law, reliable court system that you can, transparent courts that you can rely on.
We're down to 5 countries, Kelvin.
Oh, John, you're a skeptic. I think that in addition, look, in that kind of vein, a must-have would be a history of kind of consistent treatment of investors, i.e. no sudden shift in goalposts and or kind of violation of stability agreements. That would be, to me, that would be kind of the rank as the top 4 must-have.
Okay.
A few nice to haves. One would be, certainly doesn't hurt if the host country that where your company is has a bilateral investment treaty with whatever company you're investing in. That's certainly a nice to have. I would say, again, that kind of as we discussed earlier in the PV context, but some historical context or experience with the sector, also nice to have. That you'll already be kind of a little way up the curve if that happens to be there. You asked for 2 things. What are the must-haves, and then what are red flags? I guess some red flags would be, well, obviously the converse of one of your must-haves. If the jurisdiction has a history of kind of reversing course, moving goalposts, kind of sudden shifts in its policies and or not adhering to its agreements, well, that would be a definite red flag. And the other thing, John, just kind of comes to me is, well, this isn't a prohibition in any way, but something I think you really want to take time and attention to understand is, if you're developing a new project in an area that has kind of is very well populated and requires resettlement associated with the new development, again, there's lots of kind of proven practices and and approaches for how to do resettlement well. But that is an area where, if it was me and I was looking at making a large investment, I'd really want to understand, the number of people that would need to be resettled, the likelihood they'd be prepared to be resettled, what it's going to take in order to do that. You need to commit the time in advance, the time for that process, time subsequent to monitor and support communities as they've been relocated. And I think that today, more than, you think back 20, 30 years ago, how that was achieved versus what's required today. That's an area where, again, it's not a red flag in that you can't proceed, but you better make sure you're prepared to do it well, and to take the time and make the investment to ensure it's done well.
Sure. No, makes sense. You've had experience with the mining sector in Africa, I believe, also a little bit in Asia. How is, and you're in Toronto, you're still very much plugged into the global mining community. What is the perception amongst that network that you're part of Latin America versus Africa or other, significant mining investment destinations around the world, including, Canada, Australia, and traditional ones?
Yeah, that's always a challenging question, John. It changes, as you know. It's static. But I think a couple of things. First of all, it's really important not to generalize, which we all tend to do. But Africa, I think there's 54 countries in Africa, and Latin America, 20 countries in Latin America. You add the Caribbean and that mixture, now 30 plus, something like that. Maybe wrong on the numbers, but within that, there are jurisdictions which are, time-tested, proven, stable. You can operate reliably, presuming you're doing everything, properly and operating responsibly. And there's definitely jurisdictions within each of those, between Africa and Latin America, where at this point they'd be considered more no-go zones. And that may change. Again, nothing stays the same forever. And jurisdictions that have historically been seen as kind of, most favored nation kind of jurisdictions, that changes too. So you have to be pretty nimble. And I think, though, the other point, John, you touched on this a little earlier, is sometimes it's not even just at a kind of country national level. Provinces matter.
Yeah.
Within country, some provinces can be very kind of mine friendly and supportive, others just a lot more resistant. And so, you have to decide it. And part of the challenge in this business, of course, is you have to go where the good deposits are. So you don't always get to choose, which jurisdiction you're in, but you do get to choose kind of how and when you make a large scale investment, and ensuring that you've got the pieces in place to kind of mitigate risk in that context, I think is obviously important.
Sure. Now, you've sat down with lots of governments and also different, branches of government, national and subnational levels. And, I think of anyone I've worked with, you've probably been through more of those negotiations and really made an effort to understand their point of view, but also made an effort to persuade them when you thought that perhaps they were at least misinformed, if not lacking strategic direction on how they engage with mining companies. But if you were hired by a mining jurisdiction, what are some of the pieces of advice that you would give them to ensure that they not only attract mining investment, but they attract good mining investment that's going to really help develop their region?
Well, that's a good question, John. I think that, there's no surprises here, but I think first of all, ensuring that you've got kind of, as I described earlier, kind of mining code, general kind of regulations and operating framework that is clear, consistent, transparent, that you don't create situations where nothing has to stay the same forever. But what is very difficult for mining companies, and as you know, John, I mean, most mining, they're very capital intensive, very high level investment. It takes time to recover that capital, and there's the risk rates of balance sheets and everything in between. And so what I don't know any serious company around the world who is looking for favors, in the sense that companies are perfectly happy to have a high crossbar in terms of requiring environmental performance, all the ESG factors we spoke about, the need to redistribute the economic benefits of the project nationally and through the economy generally. So in other words, an equitable sharing of the economic benefits of a project. I think that's just a given now, and all good companies think that way. What is a deterrent to investment? So what I would advise those governments is, be clear, be transparent, set your expectations, and companies will decide, do these make sense for us on a going forward basis? And if so, we'll invest. And if they don't, fair enough, they won't. And I think tied to that, you see a lot of discussion, and this has been ongoing for years, but discussion around permitting timelines. That's another area where, again, companies aren't looking for relaxed regulations. They're not looking for shortcutting processes. But what they need to know is, if you've got a project that will actually stand on its merits, that the engineering is done to ensure that the environmental best practices and technologies that we talked about are in place, that it's developed strong stakeholder relationships and has commitments to its community programs and so forth, and it's taken the time and effort and energy and cost, and it's significant cost, to get a project to that point, and then it enters a permitting phase. Again, no one is looking for special treatment, but there needs to be some certainty that if you meet all those thresholds, you will, one, be granted a permit, and two, be granted it in a reasonable amount of time. In other words, indeterminate timelines for permitting are really will become prohibitive for mining investment, because nobody can just take that chance of being in a protracted review, especially if, again, it's not based on kind of the merits of the project. So if there's any opaqueness, if you will, to that permitting process, then that's a challenge. And so again, the converse of that, if I was advising governments, again, no special treatment, but be very clear on what's required. And if the company meets this threshold, then it will be allowed to proceed. And if not, fair enough. No one, that's a risk the company takes.
Across several jurisdictions, I mean, Peru's probably the most dramatic. The number of permits has leapt. I mean, somebody once said to me, it's gone from 20 to 200 in Peru. I have no idea if that's an accurate number, but the point being that is this greater number of permits, is it, are these legitimately needed permits, or is this just a lack of coordination by governments to streamline the process, consolidate some of these permits together? Why has the number of permits kind of exploded in so many jurisdictions? What's your sense?
Well, I think a couple of things, John. First of all, I'm not sure if you're combining concerns over different permitting processes, i.e. places where you have a federal process, and when you get through it, you still have a provincial process, and is there undue overlap and inconsistency? That's always been a challenge. And so I think countries that look to, as Canada is now, harmonizing its approval process, federal and provincial together, I think that's a very smart approach. It just makes sense.
Right. Sure.
And so that, in terms of the number of permits, I think that what matters, that there's often, I mean, historically, there's always been a high number of permits. Some of them are simple operating things. You need a permit for pressurized vessels, for example. Well, that's a routine permit you should get. It's like when you build a house, you need your basic approval to build the house. Then afterwards, there's all kinds of other little things that need to fall into place. What hasn't fundamentally changed are the principal permits that allow you to develop or not. And that's kind of where I've been centering. However, to your point, if in that collection of other, what should be otherwise routine permits, there's the risk that not getting one of those routine permits can hold up the overall development or your ability to start production, and you can, for lack of better terms, be held hostage because of one of those, well, then that is problematic. And it really goes to the earlier point which I raised, which is all companies need is to know exactly what's expected of them, and they'll meet that test or they won't. If they don't, everyone accepts the project shouldn't proceed. And if they do, then it must. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's how I'd characterize it.
I think the other thing, and I remember a comment in the past being raised about how mine was building, I think, housing structures, and they were 3 feet apart, and they should have been 3.5 feet apart. And at the end of the day, there was no harm done to the community. There's no harm done to anyone. There's no health issues or no safety issues. But because it wasn't precisely the code, the regulator sort of stopped the whole project for several days, costing God knows how many thousands of dollars. And whereas in other jurisdictions, there's a degree of reasonable, this is not threatening anything. This is not, we're going to waive this. But that requires regulators who have experience. So I think that the sort of technical assistance, or it's not enough to just say, okay, you're a regulator and you're in charge of enforcing X mining code, but actually training those people on the reality of structure, of the issues they're regulating, I think is something that I've seen time and time again, not just in mining, but in several sectors, because a lot of these positions are politicized. These are new people every 4 years, as opposed to technocrats that are trained and stuff and remain on the job. You get that kind of inflexibility around enforcement that it becomes unreasonable, especially when you're trying to build a small city in a very remote part of the world,
Yeah. Yeah, John, look, I mean, I know what you're saying. It's almost the no good deed goes unpunished scenario. But look,
right.
I think everything you said is right. I think, though, if I were involved in that situation, I mean, I guess the question I'd be asking myself is, okay, the code was 3.5 feet. We built 3 feet. Why didn't we build 3.5 feet? Number one. I mean, maybe there's a good reason for that.
Right.
But would it have made sense to go back and explain, listen, here's why we're doing it. Can we get that done first? And often, again, you're right, and I get it. People are trying to do a good thing and go forward, and who would expect that would even be an issue half a foot? But I think there's so many variables we can't control and unknowns we can't control. To the extent we can deal with things that we can't control like that and ensure we're doing everything to code, then it obviously argues for doing that. But you're right. I mean, it does need to be a bit of a give and take on both sides, and I think that's why if you think of companies operating and taking that good neighbor philosophy, how would you expect to be treated by your neighbor? Right. You're doing renovations to your house and you had to tweak a little bit here and there. You have a good neighbor on the other side. Well, they're probably going to let you get away with it. You don't have great relationships with a neighbor, maybe not so much.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Comes back to building that goodwill from the very beginning. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And you're always, but there will always be one-off situations like you just described. You hope that that's not the overwhelming majority of them.
Sure. We have one interesting question from Raziel Zizman, who I think you know. And he's interested in your opinion about Saudi Arabia, which has become a jurisdiction that has really become interested in promoting mining and seems to have taken some interesting and positive steps, some pretty logical steps in terms of developing themselves as mining jurisdiction. What is your sense, if you have an opinion on Saudi Arabia, in terms of what they've done well and maybe what still needs to be done?
Yeah, I do actually. And Brazil, nice to hear from you. Look, I was involved when we were building a mine called Jebel Sayed, copper mine in Saudi Arabia, and our partner was Ma'aden, the state mining company. It was a very good experience, by the way. Through the negotiating piece with Ma'aden, we brought them in as a partner, and subsequently, and yeah, I have been kind of tracking what's happening in Saudi, and I think in very much in a positive way, both in terms of kind of the cultural shifts that are happening. It takes time, but there's no question. I mean, they are serious about diversification, expanding more into the sector, and I think they will take a thoughtful approach to it. And I think they're going to be successful. So I noted a recent announcement just this week. I think that Barrick is doing more in Saudi with Ma'aden, I believe, and I think that's a good thing. I'll tell you the other thing is that, from my experience dealing with the state mining company Ma'aden, they were very keen on kind of adopting worldwide best practices. So there was never a discussion around cutting corners, etc. And I know initially the skepticism is, well, are you in Saudi because once you have a government partner, you just do what you want. That was 100% not the case. They want things to be done the exact opposite, to a very high level, and I think that's encouraging.
Yeah, I think there's a new generation of leadership in the entire Gulf that, first of all, we're schooled abroad and do want access to best practices. Absolutely.
Yeah. And by the way, they could afford them.
Exactly. Kelvin, there's so much we could discuss here. The time has flown by, and in respect to your time and the time of others who've dialed into this, I'll leave the discussion at that, but really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your insights. It's just, I don't think people like you appreciate just how much you know and how valuable it is to share that knowledge. So hopefully this has been a useful venue for you to reflect on your own career, and I certainly know it's been valuable to those dialing in. So thank you for your time, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Well, it's a very, very charitable of you to say, John. Thank you. You're gracious as always, and thank you for anybody who took the time to listen today. I'm surprised you did, but thank you very much in any event.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Kelvin.
Bye-bye.
All the best.